G'day guys, and today, in this video, I want to draw some parallels between the trials of Socrates and events that are currently going on in our metapolitical battle, our metapolitical discourse, deciding where our information comes from, who we trust, and that sort of thing. Now, why do I turn to Socrates? Well, a few years ago, I guess it was a few years ago at this point, I read the 3 texts on Socrates. It was a really great book. They have 3 different texts on Socrates, mainly, of course, the main one being his trial, being the Apology. And this is the one that really reverberated me because I saw many parallels between what happened to Socrates, how he was treated by the orthodoxy, by the state, and what's happening nowadays with independent content creation. So I'll begin by giving a short little account of pertinent events in Socrates' life that led up to the trial. So we can skip over his early life and his military service and that sort of thing, and we can skip to the point where Socrates was declared the wisest man in the world by the Oracle of Delphi. Now this is of course very significant at the time because the Oracle of Delphi was the mouthpiece of the gods, delivering prophecies from the gods and that sort of thing. Now initially, Socrates did not believe that the oracle's response was correct because he personally believed he didn't possess any wisdom whatsoever, so he was very confused as to why he was being called wise when he possessed no wisdom. So what he decided to do was test the riddle by approaching men around Athens he considered to be wise and asking them to refute, asking them questions in order to refute the oracle's pronouncements. So he spoke to people like statesmen, poets, artisans, seers, and that sort of thing. So as he questioned them, obviously probably over this period of time developing the Socratic method, Socrates concluded that a lot of these people, they were smart, they may have even been geniuses, and they all thought they knew a great deal, and they all thought they were very wise, but in fact they knew very little and they weren't actually that wise at all. Now this is obviously pretty interesting because these are the people who control the orthodoxy. They have the hands on the power of the state, the power of culture, the power of commerce, and this sort of thing, but they seem to know very little and they don't seem very wise. This led Socrates to a rather profound conclusion. Paradoxically, by knowing that he himself was not wise, this made him the wisest person in the world because he was aware of his own ignorance, whereas everyone else was not. They considered themselves wise, whilst he did not. So essentially what he's saying is that his wisdom stems from his ignorance, which again is a very paradoxical state to be in. It's highlighted very nicely in a quote from the Apology, which I'll read you now, where he's addressing one of his accusers. "I am wiser than this man. It is likely that neither of us knows anything worthwhile, but he thinks he knows something when he does not." So obviously this develops the idea that in order for there to be wisdom, learning, there first has to be ignorance. If you think you know everything, then you're not going to engage in that learning process, that process of generating wisdom. So obviously you don't arrive into this world full of wisdom. You have to learn, you have to question, you have to interpret, and that's how you build up knowledge and thus ignorance. But if you arrive at a state in arrogance where you think that you are wise, then you're just saying to yourself that you don't need to engage in this process anymore. You're done, you're finished, 100%. You are wise. But then you're not going to be engaging in that questioning process, that gathering of information, that development of ideas, this back and forth, this discussion that you can have with people to further your own knowledge. And as such, by declaring yourself wise, all you're doing is demonstrating that you're not wise at all. But if you stay in a state of acknowledging your own ignorance, then you can obviously at any time, by being ignorant, engage in this process of gathering information and questioning to develop your own wisdom. So what essentially occurred by Socrates running around questioning everyone is that he determined that the politicians were impostors, the poets did not understand their own poetry, and the craftsmen, like the prophets and the seers, did not understand the things they spoke. Now this is obviously a big problem because he's quite clearly clashing with the current course of Athenian politics and society. He's running quite afoul of the orthodoxy. It didn't also help that he was praising Sparta at the time, which was the arch rival to Athens and would shortly take over Athens following Socrates' death. So Socrates was courting disaster by questioning the status quo of an unstable state, and this led about to his trial, where he was charged with corrupting the youth and impiety against the gods, because Socrates did not recognize or appreciate or outright worship or even believe in the state-recognized gods of Athens, so obviously the Greek pantheon. Now this is the point in the Apology that I really clicked, and I definitely saw the parallels to our modern world. Now, let's go into a bit of current history with the modern world. What's going on at the moment? Well, there's a lot going on, but one of the big things that's going on at the moment is there's this transition from people where they're getting their news from, where they're getting their wisdom from, information about the world and that sort of thing. There's been a big transition from the old guard of the media, your cable news, your radio and that sort of thing, to independent content creation online. So you've got people on YouTube, the first wave of tech, obviously YouTube, Facebook, Twitter and that sort of thing. But more recently, due to the abuse that these big tech platforms keep heaping upon their own users, there's been a second wave of tech with things like Bitchute, Gab and Minds and that sort of thing. So there's been a massive shake-up in where people are getting their information from, and this is a big problem for establishment groups because if you control and have a monopoly over information, well, it's very hard to be uprooted. But that's essentially what's happening nowadays. People are jumping on YouTube, they're jumping on Bitchute, they're jumping on Gab, and they're saying, look at all these establishment groups, these establishment media groups and that sort of thing. Look how much they lie and slander. They love war, they love censorship, they don't want you to be free. And this is creating big problems for the establishment media outlets because their viewership is crashing and their audiences, their average age, I've read for CNN and Fox and groups like this in the United States, the average viewership, the age of the viewership I should say, is in their late 60s. So their viewership is on the way out, and there's going to come a crunch time where within the next decade or 2 decades, a lot of their viewership is going to die off and these companies are just going to be crushed into nothing. And they're being thoroughly outcompeted because obviously the overhead for me to make this video right now is nothing. It cost me $20 to get this microphone. I bought the laptop years ago for schoolwork. It cost me nothing to make this, but if you want to, run a big studio and have a big office and fancy makeup and fancy lights and editing and that sort of stuff, that costs a lot of money, and all you're doing is delivering the same content slower, because obviously you have to set that stuff up, whereas all I have to do is open up my phone, put on the computer and that sort of stuff. That's a big problem. You're delivering boring news, news that people don't want to hear about because you refuse to talk about certain things, because you don't want to get called racist, or you're scared of big government getting down your neck, or it's just not what you want to talk about for political reasons, and you're doing so in a very inefficient manner. So obviously this is, as I've already said, crushing you in terms of being a viable business. Now, where does this come into corrupting the youth? Well, obviously the average age of people who watching independent content creation, it's quite low. So we're talking 18 to 25 mostly, but even lower. We have, I started watching independent content when I was in my 15, 16, that sort of mid-teen and that sort of thing. And this is a big problem because obviously you want to capture the younger audience because they're going to be around for longer, and that's it. And you want to be hip to the new generation, that sort of thing. And that's obviously another thing establishment media sources aren't good at, is being hip. They're not innovative. They got on the internet too slow, and people don't care. They don't understand memes, they don't understand the linguistics, whereas I do, and I'll spout off memes and make funny stuff and that sort of thing, and that doesn't mesh well with what the establishment media wants to do. And I don't think it would look sincere or genuine at all if they if they started to do what I do. So essentially what's been happening is the mainstream media, other establishment groups such as Twitter and Facebook, have been using their clout, because they still have clout. They're not gone yet. They still have the ears of millions of people, potentially billion people around the world, and they're using their clout to attack their competitors, their fiscal competitors, because obviously the bottom line is they're losing out on a lot of money because people aren't watching them. They're watching people like me, or people who are more relevant in the independent content creator, your Stephen Crowders, your Dave Rubins, your Stefan Molyneux, and that sort of thing. So they're using their clout, they're using their reach to reach out and attack independent content creation, and also the websites that host such things, are willing to host such things. And that's where the parallels with the corruption of youth comes into it, because that's what they're saying. They're corrupting the youth. Oh, radicalization on YouTube, Gab is a Nazi site, Bitchute is full of extremism and this sort of thing. Oh, think of the children. The state must step in to censor these things. Keep it away from your children. Just watch nice, sanitized CNN, which will lie to you about the WikiLeaks and what was it? One of these American sites that fake the Syrian war footage. I haven't even looked into that too much yet. Or, nice sanitized Australian media, which will be raided by the government for saying the wrong things, essentially. So that's the big problem there. They're reaching out, and just like Socrates was abused by the orthodoxy at the time, the poets, the tradesmen, the statesmen, so we are too being abused by the state, very literally sometimes, with hate speech laws and that sort of thing, and obviously establishment commercial interests. We got your Facebooks, your establishment media, as I've talked about ad nauseum at this point. So the second charge, impiety against the gods, that Socrates was charged with, doesn't seem to mesh so well, at least on the surface, because obviously we don't live as a theocratic society nowadays. There's multiple religions, some people are not even religiously motivated at all, like myself. But the way I look at this is, obviously back then, being theocratic, being pious was part of the orthodoxy. That's just what people did. And Socrates, by choosing to ignore that and outright speak against it, well, he was challenging the orthodoxy. And that's parallels quite nicely with what's going on nowadays. Independent content creation online is not the same stuff that you see on CNN, on ABC News, on Fox News, whatever you want, whatever your preferred poison of choice. It's different stuff. It's stuff that often runs counter to the narratives put out by the mainstream media. So they'll say something and we'll counter with something else, that sort of thing. It increases competition of ideas, which is obviously not on if you're an establishment person. So that's where that parallel comes in rather nicely. People like myself, Stefan Molyneux, Dave Rubin, and this sort of thing, we're challenging the orthodoxy. We're looking at the way society is run, the way governments operate, the way culture is working, and we're saying, no, we don't like this. Here are our suggestions, here are things we don't like, here's how we could do things better. And this is obviously terrible for people who are part of the orthodoxy. Just like how Socrates was abused by the craftsmen and the prophets and the seers, we too are being abused by the big tech companies, moneyed interests, and that sort of thing. And that's what it really comes back to at the end of the day. The bottom line is about money. Everyone who watches independent content is someone who's probably not watching a mainstream media source. And these companies can't survive without viewership, which obviously generates the money. So at a very visceral and real level, their existence is threatened by people like me, which is why they're so vicious towards independent content creation. The tale of the orthodoxy lashing out against counterculture is one that's as old as time. We're talking about ancient Greece here, with Socrates running around questioning the state, questioning the orthodoxy, being impious and that sort of thing, and he was punished for it very, very viscerally. It ended up with his death, in case you didn't know that. I mean, he didn't help himself. There were ways for him to wiggle out of it, but he was strong and he stuck to his guns and he said, I will never stop speaking, and you should all pay for my accommodation, meals for the rest of my life, rather than accepting a meager punishment. He was true to his principles and it cost him his life. Obviously I want to avoid that. I don't want people to die. I'd rather we resolve the situation peacefully. Obviously people want to make that difficult by writing propaganda and that sort of thing, which is why it's more important than ever that you support and watch and create independent content. I think we will crush these establishment media groups out of existence. It'll just take a little bit of time, and it will certainly take no small application of will. But yes, the stipulations of the trials of Socrates still bear much relevance to our current discourse today. It's the same sort of stuff. The orthodoxy is lashing out at that which is seeking to replace it. Thanks all for sticking around, and have a good one.